N C HEGDE, who will be again speaking on inbound investment, but other than FDI. To complete the whole inbound investment, we are divided into two sessions. Today's speaker, Shri N C HEGDE, is a partner of Deloitte and is based in Mumbai. He is currently the M&A tax leader for Deloitte in India. He has a wide experience of more than 23 years serving Indian corporates and multinational clients in the field of direct taxation, international taxation and exchange control activities. He specializes in devising inbound investment strategies for clients intending to invest in India. N C HEGDE is a member of Institute of Chartered Accountant of India. With this short, the biodata is short, but all will realize after this session that his experience is vast. With this, we present Shri N C HEGDE to all of you. I request Yatin Bhai, moment to subject. I request our President Yatin Bhai to present the memento on behalf of the chamber. Sir, over to you. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, friends. Good morning, good afternoon, sir. Good to see such a large audience for a subject like FEMA. And shows growing importance of FEMA today. As you know, FEMA is not as interesting probably as the Income Tax Act because we don't have too many interpretations and case laws on the subject. So the only way you get to know about FEMA is that when you make a visit to the RBI and you probably learn that what you thought was right is not really right. So it is in that sense a little challenging. Even on important topics like whether who's a resident, non-resident like of FEMA, there is hardly any case law on the subject so as to kind of help you or guide you on possible views. One disadvantage of the income tax is that there are as many views as there are tribunals and court rulings on the subject, so it does confuse you a lot. But on FEMA there is hardly any ruling, so you really don't get to an exposition of a law on the subject. First of all, let me thank the chamber. Chamber has always been very kind to me. The president, Mr. Bhatt, and all others who are here, and actually it's more like a friend and a family for me, and therefore I always love to come to any activity of the CITC because they have been actually doing a lot of sterling job in helping all of us professionals actually learn. And I think once you get an invitation to speak on a subject, it is the best form of learning. And I'm not saying that only as a cliche, it is really so because as I was preparing this presentation, there are a couple of schedules which actually came in only probably in the month of April. And when I looked at the policy, the FDI policy which was issued by the FIPB on 17th April, I suddenly noted that there was a schedule called Schedule 2A, which I had not noted, the schedule which related to the FPIs. And that suddenly made me wonder whether there was a schedule. I had to go back and see, and there indeed was a schedule of that sort. The LLPs also had come in pretty recently. So a lot of activity in the subject, a lot of changing, and I think that's what keeps you on in this particular subject. I think in the earlier session, Mr. Shabbir Motorwala has already covered, I think in great detail, FDI, which is the direct investment. What is the FDI or what is the long-term investment part of it? And what my job here is to cover the remainder, the residuary. So it's like if you take the Income Tax Act, it is like an income from other sources, other things other than what FDI has already been covered by Shabbir. I think I'll be proposing to take that. Naturally, it's not going to be as interesting as FDI in itself from a practitioner's point of view. Certainly, there is a lot of complexity involved, but from a practitioner's point of view, maybe not as interesting. So if I give you a cricket analogy, it is after the first 6 overs are completed, then really the next players have to settle down because your fields are well spread and it becomes a little routine. So my emphasis is going to be to let you know the spirit behind the different legislation, behind the legislation, behind the schedules, and what is it that you should be looking at? Because after that, you really have to look at the schedule from time to time, and there are a lot of changes which keep on getting made in the schedule. So don't bother about that if you don't know everything really by rote or by memory. It is the only thing that you need to really know what was the intention, what was the whole rationale behind. Because as I again go back to my earlier statement, unlike income tax, where you have a lot of exposition of law, there is no much exposition here. So whenever in doubt, probably look at the spirit, and if the spirit is appealing, maybe that is an interpretation which you would probably do be better with. And so what do I cover here? The foreign direct investment schedule 1 has already been covered. Everything other than that is something that I would like to cover. The foreign portfolio investments, investments on a non-repatriation basis, other investment schedule 5 which I won't cover in such great detail. I put that as an annexure in the schedule because it is largely related to debt securities and other securities which keep on getting added from time to time, and all these set of investors who are allowed to invest in it. So clearly the schedule will show you the all the securities which you are permitted to invest in, and that is quite comprehensive. So what I've done in the presentation is a little detailed and a little fat or too big, but the whole idea was to cover each and every aspect of the other than FDI in this so that it becomes a self-contained document on its own. We look at foreign venture capital investment also, Indian depository receipts, and then finally QFIs. Foreign investments in LLP, I believe, has been covered by the earlier speaker again, but I will make a reference to it, and the only reason I covered it here was because partnership firms were to be covered, and therefore LLP is in a way a partnership of sorts, at least under the Income Tax Act, and that is what I thought I should take up, right? And finally, some annexures which are reference, especially the reference to Schedule 5 and the various kind of securities that can be invested, and that is where the annexures will fit in place. By definition, I think you must have gone through this maybe in the earlier rounds. I believe you have already had several rounds, and a lot of this basic concepts which have been kind of reinforced. But only to give you a kind of a sequencing is that under the FEMA transfer of issue of security by a person resident outside India, again going back to the concept of FEMA and the structure, which again somebody must have mentioned, but under FERA the problem was that you had various sections, and in those sections you had to refer to a particular section. You had to go to section 9, section 19 and say a resident cannot do that, a non-resident cannot do that. But you then did not have really any place where you would find all the relevant provisions under one particular regulation. The best part about FEMA is that wherever they want to capture a particular regulation, that regulation is pretty much self-contained. So you have to only go into that particular regulation. For inbound investment, for example, you only need to look at the FEMA transfer or issue of a security by a person resident outside India. Once you look at that regulation and its schedules, then everything that is virtually involved with inbound investment is covered. Similarly, when you go to outbound investment, that is a separate regulation. So those regulations are self-contained, and you need to really look at those regulations, and you get everything under one particular regulation, as opposed to looking at different provisions of the Act and wondering where these provisions will apply, as was in the case of FERA. That then gives you a linkage by saying that an NRI shall have the meaning as foreign exchange management deposit regulations. It comes back to the same definition of a person who is resident outside India, who is a citizen, and was a person of Indian origin. This is something again that you must have dealt, earlier speakers must have dealt with. Who is a PIO, or a citizen of India, if he has any time held Indian passport. So here, as you must have probably heard the other speakers, the important concept which I, for the sake of emphasis or repetition, I would like to kind of point out is that there will be a resident and there will be a non-resident. Now, when you talk of non-resident, don't confuse yourself with the Income Tax Act, where a non-resident is defined purely by physical presence. If you are in India for a particular number of days, if you are outside India for a particular number of days, you are either a resident or a non-resident as per income tax. When it comes to FEMA, really, the term non-resident is a mix of both a physical presence as well as intention which is combined. And if you look at FERA as opposed to FEMA, FERA only looked at intention purely without a physical reference. And when the FEMA bill was being passed, there was probably a move to shift it to completely physical presence, like in the Income Tax Act. The Income Tax Act and FEMA would have probably been on par with each other. But probably there was some vested lobbies which intervened. And therefore, if you see now the provisions of FEMA in relation to a non-resident or a resident, and then of course non-resident is, what is not a resident is a non-resident. Is a resident is a combination of both, a combination of physical presence. So there is first of all a presumption that if a person lives in India for 182 days, then he is a resident Indian. But that presumption can be disproved either if you have taken up an employment outside India or you are outside India for a particular period, and so on and so forth. Similarly, for a person who comes to India, it is presumed that he will become a resident, and then again if he has to disprove that particular intention. So it's a combination. In absence of any things, you go in default, and you go into default in the previous year. Have you stayed in India for 182 days or not? If yes, then you become a resident. So it is a combination of both. This is the important thing to note. And based on the definition of resident, you will have then different categories. There will be a resident. That means if you look at two categories I would refer to. One, a President Obama, he is also a non-resident under the Act. And then you will have another category of a person, Mr. L.M. Mittal, who is a non-resident but is a person of Indian origin, and hence he is a NRI and also can be called a PIO. So these are the two different categories, and clearly as and when the law was evolved, the emphasis was first that when India opened up, even before we opened up in 1991, right from the 80s, the emphasis was that there are a lot of patriotic Indians here outside India who want to invest into India, and let us make available opportunities to them so that India also benefits as well as these people also get an opportunity to invest, because probably outside India they don't get a return as good as they get in India. And therefore, if you ask people, different people, you will have different views on whether NRIs are patriotic or they are only selfish, and when rates are high they will come in. So that is not something that I want to get into. But the whole schemes in 1980 onwards have been designed after that, first of all, to encourage non-resident Indians and people of Indian origin to come and invest into India. And therefore, at that point of time, other than the category of a non-resident individual, you also had a body called the overseas corporate bodies, or bodies which were owned to the extent of 60% by these people of Indian origin. So the idea was, let us encourage Indians and bodies owned by them to invest into India. At that point of time, as you know, foreign investment was out of bounds, and for every foreign investment you had to go then to the FIPB, and it could take months, government, to make any investment into India. But then a small window was opened up by which non-residents could invest into certain sectors up to certain percentages, and that is how the entire regime opened up, and that is why the NRI schemes came into place. Apart from those NRI schemes, what are the other schemes at that point of time? Then there was a portfolio investment scheme, and I think when I start the portfolio investment scheme, I will cover that in greater detail. Now, in terms of the law, what is the position of the law? Because we are all here accountants, we are lawyers, and we want to know what the law is. We don't want to go by common sense. So section 6(3)(b) is the governing section of FEMA. That says that without approval of RBI, with restriction of RBI, all these can be invested into India. And then, based on that, the FEMA transfer or issue of security, as we saw, those regulations have been notified, and those are the regulations which really govern the provisions in relation to investment by non-residents. So that is, and these really have the force of the law. Then there are, in order to help us, there are circulars which are issued by the Reserve Bank from time to time, which are called the ADMEA circulars. But if there was a circular and there was a notification and they were to contradict, and this happens very often, then the position under the law is that the notification would be more superior. And that was laid down way back in the 80s in a case called the Escorts case. Escorts was in LIC, but there was a takeover by a tycoon called Swaraj Paul. And at that point of time, this matter went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that circulars and all that is fine, but these are only instructions to authorized dealers. When it comes to the law, we will look at that point of time the FERA Act, and it's only the FERA Act which apply. We will not look at the ADMA circulars. However, unlike in income tax where you can challenge circulars by way of a writ, or circulars are not binding on tax authorities, it is not very easy to go and challenge ADMA circulars, even if sometimes they do not represent a correct piece of law, or the FAQs, for example. A lot of angst which was caused by the circular in relation to the LERM scheme, where they said you cannot set up companies and things like that. Now that was clearly something which was not reflected in the law, but one has to often go and abide by those provisions only because of the fact that you have a Reserve Bank of India, and in a FEMA you don't want to take an aggressive position. To then come on to the industrial policy, the Department of Industrial Policy, which issues various press notes from time to time for guidance on various issues, and the Ministry of Commerce, who then finally not to be left behind by RBI, because RBI started coming out with these half-year circulars. They also issue a circular every year, and the latest circular, as you may see, is the circular of 17th April, which lays down the entire comprehensive policy in relation to foreign direct investment. So this is only a repetition of what was mentioned earlier. Regulated by the RBI, Department of Industrial Policy Promotion is the mother body. This is the section 6(3)(b), which says that RBI has the power to restrict, prohibit, restrict or regulate the transfer or issue of any security. The regulations, the FEMA transfer issue of regulations. Good part in recent times is that there is a master circular which comes in every year. And that master circular is extremely helpful, drafted very well with by the Reserve Bank of India. It is a big challenge, because if I don't know other speakers have made a mention or not, because very often what happens is that the government announces a particular policy, and that is often a knee-jerk reaction in response to a particular situation. So if there was a lot of pharma companies which are being acquired all of a sudden, and the government thought, no, this is not good, because we will have a problem with foreign pharma companies ruling the roost, and drugs and medicines will become very costly. So they went and issued a circular which said that for brownfield investment, it is no longer under the automatic route, you have to come to the FIPP for specific approval. Now very often what happens is, what they do is they don't do even consultation with the RBI. And as I mentioned, the notification of the changes in the regulations is ultimately the responsibility of the RBI. And that is where you will see the amendment made, and the brownfield investment now being notified in a regulation coming virtually after 1.5 years probably. In the case of an LLP also, it comes in after probably 2 years or 3 years. 2011 FDI and LLP was notified, and the regulations in relation to FDI by the RBI, operationalizing them, have come in 2014. So that is why there is a disconnect. And RBI is very clear on the law. The ministry there is politically motivated at times, therefore they go ahead and declare whatever is the policy. But the RBI's then officials have to work with the ministry to ensure that whatever they have said is then reflected in the regulation, and often there is a tussle between the two, which is the result why the circulars and the notifications by the RBI are issued after a considerable length of time, because ultimately they have to agree to whatever the ministry says, but they also want to ensure that there is clarity in the regulation. So you will always find regulations and circulars much more clarificatory than any position of the industrial policy really. This gives you a schematic representation, a diagrammatic representation. So what Shakir covered was the first part, I suppose, the FDI and the Schedule 1. What we have here attempted to do, what I attempted to do here is to look at the other piece, and we are really going to concentrate on the piece on the right hand side of the diagram. That is the investments by the LLPs, which is now Schedule 9, foreign portfolio investments, which are then divided into two buckets, the FII investments, the NRI PIO investments, and the RFPI investments, portfolio investor regulations. Then you have the foreign venture capital regulations, other investments which are covered by Schedule 5, IDRs, which of course may not be too relevant because this talk of foreign companies issuing deposit receipts in India, opposite of what GDRs or ADRs is. If there was a reference made to ADRs and GDRs in the earlier lecture, this is exactly the opposite. This is IDRs, a foreign company listing deposit receipts in India, and as you know, there's only one practical case of Standard Chartered Bank having issued a certificate, so I'm not going to spend too much of time on it. What I will do rather is spend more time on, from a practitioner's point of view, investment on a non-repatriation basis, because that does throw up some opportunities at times in terms of planning, and which is again covered by Schedule 4, and then there is the QFI and the NRI PIO. So this is an overall representation of the various schedules which are contained and which comprehensively cover everything that I have to say. With that, we now move on to portfolio investments. Right? They are contained in Schedule 2, 2A, and NRI PIO Schedule 3. Now, let me give you a little bit of flavor about portfolio investments. Portfolio investments are generally aimed at encouraging people to come in, and the whole idea there is to stabilize your equity markets, to stabilize monies which by its inherent nature is not there for a very long time, and where the investor does not really look at controlling interest in the company. So here he is really looking at a return of income. He is not really looking at having a say in the running of the enterprise, and that is what is really called as portfolio investment. The Chandrasekhar Committee, which was set up by the government in order to rationalize the different forms of portfolio investment, in fact, suggested that portfolio investment be defined as anything which is below 10% be called as portfolio investment. That definition has not yet come up. You will see that logic being extended in a lot of places because there is a 10% cap for all these investments. But that logic is that anything which is less than 10%, let's consider it as being as portfolio investment in nature. So you have three main buckets under the portfolio investment. One is the foreign institutional investor, the RFPI, and the NRI PIO. NRI PIO was the first one to start off the block. And again, in terms of history, again, as I said, to give you a little bit of background, this was when Rajiv Gandhi then was the Prime Minister, and at that point of time, or probably a little earlier than that, maybe Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister, and the thought was, let us get our NRIs and our OCDs to come and invest into our markets, the stock markets. And there was this portfolio investment scheme, and in terms of the portfolio investment scheme, you could have an OCD or the individual investing into the Indian stock markets, which at that point of time were only ruled and dictated by financial institutions like the LIC and the others who actually used to drive the market. The FIIs had not yet come into place that time. So an NRI PIO could invest up to say 5%, 10%, 24% and so on and even more. And it was this 5% or 10% which was sought to be taken advantage of. You know, the accountants and lawyers are always creative or inventive, and we always see and tailor how these investments, what the investment limits were, and based on those investment limits, an aggressive takeover was made in relation to both escorts and another company, I forget the name of the company, where Swaraj Paul wanted to actually control and hostile takeover in those days. There was no SEBI takeover for those days, and acquire control of the company, which again led to changes being made in the NRI PIO schedule, where these caps that you saw now came in, the 10%, the 24% all put together, and that was the origin of the NRI PIO. When it comes to the FII, FII is, you know, after our liberalization, we invited FIIs to come to the market to broaden, and the whole theory or the premise was that FII investment is long-term investment. This is the investment by pension funds, other universities, superannuation funds. Is going to be in India for a long time. This will help to stabilize markets. As we have all seen, that's not necessarily true. When there were IPOs which were being launched, FIIs used to invest on day one and take out the money on day 2. So it doesn't become really a long-term investment, but the theory behind the entire FII investment is that this is a really long-term investment. FIIs include AMCs, pension funds, mutual funds, investment trusts and so on, as I just mentioned. RBI gives general permission to SEBI registered FIIs to invest in India under the portfolio investment scheme. So an application is first made by the FII to SEBI, and once SEBI gives you the approval, it also does a quick check with the RBI, and then there is a consolidated approval. There is no further need to make an application to the RBI, because that SEBI approval is the comprehensive approval. With that approval, then you go to the custodian. The custodian then asks you to also appoint a tax agent of sorts, and that is what a lot of us do for a living. Some of our departments, where you compute those various traits in relation to investments made by FIIs from time to time. So SEBI is the nodal port of the FIIs. SEBI gives the permission to the FIIs, and it is based on this permission that the FIIs make the investments into the market. The new development which is now coming as a result of the foreign portfolio investment regulations is, the FDI regulation is, that FIIs, QFIs and all of them are sought to be aggregated into one, and they will all be called as foreign portfolio investors. Now this was have to happen from 1st April, but I think banks have sought for some more time, and I believe now the FPI regulations which actually kick in from 1st June 2014. But till such time, FII regulations will continue. So these FII regulations now are going to have only a short period of life. But not to really worry, because the regulations of FPI are more or less on the same lines as that of a FII really, and the spirit is also very similar. So what is really the rule? The rule is that total shareholding of either an FII or a sub-account shall not exceed 10% of the paid-up capital of the company, or 10% of the paid-up capital of the debenture of each series, the convertible debenture here. Because convertible debentures, as you know, compulsory convertible debentures, a reference may have been made in the earlier lecture, they are treated as equity for the purpose of FDI. And the second condition is that total holding of all FIIs and sub-account of FIIs cannot exceed 24% of the paid-up capital. This is only to ensure that FIIs really don't get into a block and into concert with other foreign investors under the direct investment route and capture the equity of a company more than whatever is desired in that particular sector as such. The limit of 24% can be increased by the concerned company by passing a special resolution. So if you have a company, and this earlier used to be a very popular mode, if a company had made private placement to FIIs or was open to investment by FIIs, then normally what would have happened was that they were sending a signal that I am ready to accept higher standards of corporate governance, I am much better in managing my affairs, and therefore if a placement to an FII would automatically mean a jump probably in the share prices of the company. So then after taking that, you could also decide that look, I am also going, because 24%, and if you are a company which has a lot of investor appetite, 24% may not be enough for a lot of companies. So companies like HDFC and others also went out and said, no, we will pass a board resolution by which the 24% can be increased to maybe 74% or as the case may be. In those days, the foreign cap on banks was not there, and financial institutions were not there. The NBFC regulations came in a little later, and hence there was this possibility for HDFC. Like similarly, many other companies said, now I am now resolving by way of a general resolution to increase the stake to whatever it may be, 24 to 74 or 24 to 100% as the case may be. That means that they are welcoming FII investment to the extent of the FII. Of course, your headroom for other foreign investors will considerably reduce, but this was something that was possible. But the scheme goes by the fact that you have to conduct all your transactions to a registered broker. Then the next point was that, as I said, it became fashionable for companies to issue to FIIs prior to an IPO, because that again sent a signal that this is a company in which FIIs,